Thanks to you all for coming on this sweltering day. And I won't take it amiss if I see sort of heads nodding. So, as Hilary suggested, my talk today is drawn from research I've been doing for the ERC project on diseases of modern life, 19th century perspectives, and particularly in relation to public health movements in the Victorian era. For literary critics in particular, Victorian public health and the sanitation movements have had a rather bad press in recent decades. One has the Foucauldian line where you trace the intrusive surveillance and disciplining of the body, or we have Alan White and Peter Salibras' excellent work, but the Bakhtinian Freudian reading, where the city is layered upon the body, producing disgust at the filth found in the lower reaches. As literary critics, we also think of the Mrs. Pardigals of this world, distributing their sanitary and health tracts with monstrous patronising self-complacency and complete disregard for the actual conditions and health and welfare of the poor. And there is also, of course, the very dark shadow cast by Chadwick's utilitarian New Poor Law. Scholarship in this vein has produced excellent work in the interrelations of the body and the city. There is a danger, however, to use a rather apt cliche maybe, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In this talk, I'm going to argue that there is in fact much we can learn from the Victorian public health movements. In the vision many upheld of the interconnectedness of bodily and mental health and the environment, they anticipate medical and ecological debates of our own time. I start with one of the first public health journals, the Sanitary Review and Journal of Public Health, which, as you'll see, edited by Benjamin Ward Richardson, has as its motto, it has Hajir as its figurehead, goddess of health, and national health is national wealth. This was a motto invented by Richardson for the publication of the journal that he edited. But it went on to become almost the rallying cry of the sanitary movement. There are, of course, many ways of reading this. You could say, well, it's a utilitarian. In order to extract wealth, you have to have healthy bodies. Or alternatively, you could take a gentler interpretation, which I think is the Richardson one, and suggest that really wealth does lie really within the health of all individuals. And indeed, he later reversed himself and decided really it ought to have been national wealth is national health. Just a bit about Benjamin Ward Richardson, looking wonderfully benign there. He was, when he died in 1896, he was described as the most famous medic in England, but very few people have heard of him other than a sort of mere tangent, really, to other people's lives. But as you can see, he made it into Strand magazine as one of the eminent figures of the day. Quick biography there. He worked very strongly with John Snow, cholera reformer, and also with Chadwick. He edited works of both of them. And with Chadwick, he produced his collected works after his death called, no, actually not after his death, called Health of Nations. So again, another play on this idea of health and nation. One of the problems, I think, in thinking about Richardson is that he was into everything. There was very few areas of medical life that he did not touch. He's primarily known probably for anaesthetics, but he also invented the lethal chamber for painless extinction of life, rather sort of disturbing, but it was all designed to aid the health of animals. He was a great cyclist, founded a cycling club. He was a member of our club and so associated with Dickens. He was very close to George Cruikshank, and he was physician to the Royal Literary Fund. So in other words, he was someone with a finger in every pie. He was also, for many years, president of the Sanitary Association and founded innumerable journals, all designed to further public health. In 1875, he was due to address the Social Science Congress in Brighton as president of the health section. In place of the dry paper on the statistics of death rates he'd prepared, he decided instead to offer an imaginative vision of a model city, Hajir, a city of health. And this is probably where you might have heard of him. Interestingly, the impact of this paper at this dry congress was immediate and immense. The Times carried an almost verbatim account as well as a lead article. In the coming days and weeks, it was reproduced and extracted not only within the UK, but actually across the world. Richardson had clearly caught the public imagination, although there was inevitably some critical commentary, particularly with his respect to his banning of drink and tobacco. But there was general enthusiasm that one should be able to transform in large measure the living conditions for large towns and to reduce drastically the incidence of disease. Richardson's utopia differs from many of its predecessors, and it is not, like Butler's Erewhon, for example, a satirical commentary on contemporary society, nor is it an unrealisable dream. Instead, it's a practical set of suggestions based on contemporary medical and scientific ideas for public health, for many of which Richardson had himself been campaigning for over the previous 20 years. Richardson addresses his work not only to his contemporaries, but also to those who have yet to be, who are ourselves unseen to ourselves, continuing our mission. This is not a standard invocation of the power of words to outlive the writer, as in Shakespeare's sonnets, nor is it attached to any notion of fame. It involves instead a deep sense of organic interconnectedness that animates all Richardson environmental and medical work. The appeal to ourselves unseen to ourselves anticipates current environmental campaigns, in which we are exhorted to look beyond our narrow horizons and to think and plan for future generations. Although there's no doubt greater urgency at present when melting ice caps do suggest the future devastation of human lifestyles and even their possible extinction, we should not underestimate the deep alarm registered by many Victorians as at the environmental monster they'd created. Nor should we assume that understanding of the delicate ecology of nature and the complete interdependency of natural and human life is of entirely recent origin. As Richardson's work reveals, in many ways, the Victorians anticipated us. Richardson dedicated the published version of Hajir to his mentor, Edwin Chadwick, who, together with the statistician William Farr, was also present at the original presentation. Now, the indelible association of Chadwick with the Poor Law and the 1842 Sanitary Report has tended to obscure a further 40 years' worth of work by Chadwick when he campaigned on an extraordinary variety of issues, from drains to national education. Richardson was, if anything, even more prolific in the set of questions to which he turned his reforming zeal, but without the Benthamite turn of mind which continued to distinguish Chadwick's work. Whilst not a radical, he rarely associates the problems of social conditions with the poor themselves, but offers, in his voluminous writings over 40 years, a steadily sympathetic analysis of the problems created by their conditions of labour and housing. Marx was to draw on Richardson's 1863 essay, Work and Overwork, for example, in Capital, in particular the depiction of the case of the needlewoman Mary Ann Walkley, who was deemed to have died from overwork in poor conditions. In his early medical life, Richardson had treated members of the gypsy community and developed, as he says, considerable admiration for them as a people, even going so far as to learn a little of their language. And this was not, I think, a romantic affectation, but rather part of the consistent respect for a simple lifestyle and detestation of what he termed the insanity of luxury. In much of his writing, he expresses contempt for the wealthy and their habits of excess. And in many regards, he adopts a Dickensian theme and style, as in his article, The Poverty of Wealth, which also became another slogan, in which he describes the clocks in a rich man's house, which ticked away in melancholy measured vibrations, as if they were everlastingly saying, one after another, keep quiet, great wealth, don't laugh, don't laugh. One can hear Dombey and Son behind that. In this article, he depicts the poverty of mind and body of the wealthy and of the poor. The first, he argues, self-inflicted, the latter thrust upon them. It is poverty, he argues, which presses man into dishonesty. in a passage of particular relevance for today's universities as they seek to replace government funding with private donations, he's particularly scathing regarding the cultural capital to be acquired for the wealthy by high-profile donations. He says, "He can become in this way and cheaply an important and great man, a benefactor, a munificent patron. How he got the wealth will never more be inquired into too nicely. It may have been by fraud, quackery, gambling, sin of any dye. Never mind, he's applied it usefully. He is a great patron. Marvellous, marvellous. He has held great wealth and not squandered it. Oh, the princely virtue." I write this having been a fundraiser. Richardson did not identify himself as a socialist, however. In this article, he expresses sympathy with the socialist cause, but distances himself from it, and that he sees the goals as too closely tied up with a quest for the luxury of wealth and minimal labour. As a true puritanical Victorian, he suggests that instead we need to exalt labour as the foundation of health and wealth. Richardson's Hygeia, or City of Health, does not, therefore, follow socialist or Owenite principles. There's no overturning of current social order. Instead, there's a scrupulous rethinking of all aspects of domestic and public architecture and organisation with regard to introducing healthier conditions. Richardson takes as its starting point Chadwick's belief that mortality rates could be reduced to 5 in 1,000 and sets out to design an environment which could help to achieve that ideal with the lowest possible general mortality and the highest possible individual longevity. One of his decrees is to abolish basement rooms, both for domestic and industrial classes, so that no one would live or work underground. There'd be wide streets to let in sunlight and no tenements or buildings over 4 stories high. The middle-class home, interestingly, would still have servants, but domestic architecture is rethought to place servants' needs at its heart. Thus, instead of customary basement rooms, the kitchen would be placed beneath the roof, so there'd be plenty of light and less carrying up and down of heavy dishes, and you'd be able to get out and carry the heavy laundry out onto the wonderful roof garden that would be at the top. And although the owners were going to be permitted the luxury of hot water in every bedroom, the overall plan is the reverse of luxurious. Poisonous wallpapers and paste are prohibited, and instead all walls are going to be glazed grey brick, though you could ornament them, maybe. With his emphasis on the importance of ventilation and the potential polluting qualities of clothing and other material objects, Richardson designs an austere environment far removed from the usual clutter of a Victorian home. He also suggests that, very much in line with the arguments now, that you should not have carpets that go to the edge, but you should have just a rug in the middle and then have the bare wood kept clean by beeswax and turpentine, which will then contribute to the sanitising properties of ozone, which obviously has a rather different register these days. But interestingly, we are exactly returning to this health advice. Also, our concerns about carbon capture are very much registered in his suggestions that there should be a form of fireplace that would then consume all forms of carbon, so it would not pollute the atmosphere. As might be expected from Richardson's close connections with Chadwick, meticulous attention is paid to the sanitary arrangements of the home. So the flushing toilet, first demonstrated at the Great Exhibition, is to be included, thus obviating the need for back premises. And perhaps the most lasting legacy that Richardson offered was the importance he placed on gardens. So the elimination of these back premises allowed garden squares to be created behind houses, which would be ornamented with flowers and trees and furnished with playgrounds for children, young and old. He also envisaged that all major public buildings would be surrounded by gardens. The churches, hospitals, theatres, banks, lecture rooms and other public buildings, as well as some private buildings, such as warehouses and stables, would be surrounded with garden space and add not only to the beauty, to the healthiness of the city. And this was a vision that was to be taken up by Ebenezer Howard in his Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which in turn then influenced city planning in the 20th century. And in one of his more ambitious plans later on, Richardson designed a wonderful radical reconstruction of London called Upper London, where he envisaged that the rooftops of all the houses would be taken off. They'd be rendered flat, and then there would be walkways and gardens right across London. And then he suggested that when tricycles came along, that you could have tricycle paths. And interestingly, he insisted that this would get you away from pollution, but that also it would be open to all, a thoroughly democratic garden. So very much like the high-rise in New York and other urban gardens that are now being constructed. One of the elements of Hygeia that was most criticised was his shunning of drink and tobacco. Richardson was an ardent temperance campaigner, but added also tobacco to the lists. I think he was possibly one of the first to draw attention to what is now termed passive smoking, although his understanding of the cause might have been a bit misplaced. So in a later text, he argues that the merciless smokers who laugh at the faddery of a woman who becomes faint if a smoker charges the air they breathe in a confined space, and outlines the case of a youth who was temporarily poisoned by inhaling the atmosphere issuing out of a small window of a club room in which a number of men were smoking freely. So a suggestion then that very much you have to think of the work circumstances of individuals. Richardson's work poses very interesting questions as how to interpret the levels of medical and social intervention he proposes. The despised sanitary officers have been discussed as the epitome of a bureaucratic state, overseeing and controlling all aspects of bodily life. Yet at a period when preventive medicine is once again seen as the desired goal, and drink and tobacco figure as some of the largest threats to health, questions of individual liberty versus responsible social control have become ever more urgent. Sorry, I'm just skip a bit here. Hygeia concludes its recommendations with a sanitarian's vision of resurrection. Richardson argues against cremation as disrupting the natural cycle, though he's later to change his mind, interestingly. And he argues for burial, but in specially created fine carnivorous earth, which would speed decomposition. Anticipating current green burials, there'd be a basketwork coffin or simply a shroud and no gravestone. Only a simple record in a nearby hall or temple, so that within a few months there'd be no remains. The natural circle of transmutation is harmlessly completed and the economy of nature is conserved. Such a conclusion is stirring in its modesty and simplicity, in keeping with Richardson's animus against pretentious buildings and the human vanity they express. There will be no visible marker of a human life, no vainglorious attempt to defeat natural processes and the workings of time, but rather a complete integration of the body with the earth. The vision is an entirely secular one of natural perfection. The sanitarian's belief that sewage, rightly handled, could by modern alchemy turn waste into natural wealth or fertilizer is here applied to the human body itself. In place of a Christian resurrection of the spirit, we're given another form of eternal life, setting humanity within a natural scale. I want to just turn briefly to some of the responses. So virtually immediately, there were products all based upon Hygeia, so you too can have your parquet floor. Health resorts marketed as the Hygeia, Bexhill-on-Sea, where else would you go to tend your overtired body and mind? There were also, in the newspapers, discussions about the control being suggested. Thus, the Standard said, it is also becoming evident that many things present left to private hands will have to be under municipal control. In cities, our best chance is to be at the mercy of public authorities rather than that of our neighbour, our tradesman, or money-making companies. And another of complete relevance today, Lloyd's weekly newspaper. We approach the idea of a model city, a paradise of patents, a municipality under medical terrorism, a wonderful phrase that, the medical terrorism, with a resolve not to be led away in bondage, but concludes, nonetheless, that the vision is inspiring and speaks of the shame that will lie upon us, which should we make no endeavours to emulate his Hygeia. There were also light-hearted parodies. this is fun, suggesting that Richardson has created out of his fantasies wealth this marvellous city of health, but suggesting at the end that as a home for its founder, it never would do, for it's certain no doctor could live there. Punch picked this up a month later, and this is a wonderful cartoon. See all the out-of-work doctors, and actually the crossing sweeper is giving the doctors money in a wonderful, topsy-turvy world. We then had, this is another Punch, the horrors of health and safety, that you can't hold a dinner party without having all your wines and your food approved. It says that ladies who are going to wear low-cut dresses have to get a certificate, and it goes on in this vein. And then there's a wonderful one this is from Funny Folks. This imagines us in the future, looking back at the absurdities of the Victorian life. It's a banquet for Dr. Richardson at his 150th year. But it just talks about the collection of antique curiosities that they have collected. A bill of health from 1875, an undertaker's hearse with appurtenance of unknown use, an instrument of mental torture and deleterious effect known as a novel or work of fiction, and a file of London sky blue full of pollution, and then the hand organ known to torture residents. So wonderfully playful, but I think does suggest the degree of impact that Richardson had. So to conclude, the sanitarian movement was the object of considerable fear and mockery within Victorian culture, and recent scholarship has tended to replicate some of these negative responses in the way it casts the sanitarian proposals as part of an encroaching and intrusive bureaucratic state. As we struggle with world crises, both of the economy and climate, it is worthwhile asking, however, whether we do need to adjust our critical frameworks and to see state and indeed international regulation in a new light. The tension between individual freedom and state power needs to be rethought in a world where we now understand the actions and habits of a daily life in one city could affect not only those of one's immediate neighbours, but citizens in another part of the globe. Despite his socialist leanings, Richardson's Hygeia cannot be counted as a socialist utopia. There's no radical redistribution of property or ownership of the means of production, and destitution is still possible. In all its meticulous understanding, however, of the intersection of the cycles of natural and human life, it looks forward to ecological forms of analysis and elements of the green politics of our own era. Richardson believed his work would be ignored in his own time, but would speak to future generations. Ironically, the reverse has been the case. His ideas were much celebrated during his life, but have now been almost forgotten, at a time when arguably they're of the highest relevance. His detestation of the ostentation of wealth, support for the dignity of a simple life, and celebration of the natural processes of death are all in accord with current green politics. Resuscitating Richardson, as it were, will offer us new insights into the operations of the sanitary beliefs of the Victorian age. While Richardson's understanding of the close interdependence of natural and social processes, which largely based on outmoded science, it nonetheless generated models of interpretation which anticipate current ecological science and systems theory. Old science can have its uses. Thank you.